For over 2 decades, a psychopathic killer travelled across the US, leaving a trail of death and destruction in his wake. His preferred target? Children. His preferred method of killing? Strangulation. Authorities would fail to connect the murders. Terrifyingly, the true extent of his crimes would only come to light after he was sent to Texas death row, by which time he would claim to have killed up to 100 men, women and children. He was the coast-to-coast killer, and the shockwaves of his crimes are still being felt today. Okay, my lovelies, before I get on with today's video, I want to say thank you to my sponsor, June's Journey. If you want to know what June's Journey is, well, it's free for a start, which is always good. And you can download this mobile game. And I promise you, when you do, you'll be like, where have my hours gone? Because it genuinely is a captivating hidden object mystery game. And it takes you back to the 1920s, which I love. The fashion, the style. I'm very much into Art Deco, so it suits me very, very well. It's got gorgeous glamour scenes. It's got this really riveting murder mystery storyline, which immediately means you should all be hooked and straight to the App Store to download it. June's Journey is an absolutely superb way that I guess can help you relax and unwind and lightly challenge your observational skills and problem solving. I say lightly challenge you. Pete, my husband, is deeply challenged by this. I'll say that before I go on. But for me, it's lightly observational skills. As every single one of you who comes to my channel loves true crime, the point is you're going to love this game. It's about a thrilling murder mystery story based on June Parker, and she's basically on a quest to solve the murder of her sister. And because of that, you have to solve loads of clues, you have to find objects that are hidden throughout basically hundreds of beautifully and carefully painted scenes. So it's a really lovely game to play as well. Now, Pete and me have been playing this before we go to bed. It helps me relax. It slightly frustrates him because I'm better than him at it. Now, from the outset, the great thing about this is it gets you talking about who could possibly be the culprit. And I have to admit that I think I genuinely have a better, shall we say, detective aspect to my personality, but let me know what you think. I know that loads of you are gonna absolutely love this game, so I'm gonna leave a link in the description below where you can download June's Journey free on Android, iOS, and on PC through Facebook Games. Get downloading it, and just remember, girls, challenge you guys, because I think you're gonna find, like me, that we're just better at it, more suspicious maybe. Welcome to True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. If you're new here, I release content on a Wednesday and a Sunday consistently. So if you like crime and consistency, then I am the channel for you. If you don't subscribe, please do. Leave me a like, leave me a comment, get involved in the live chats. And most of all, thank you for joining me. Shout out to all you Patreon subs. You're making my life so much better by making me be able to create this content. And the same to my YouTube membership. I love seeing your names show up in green on my feed. Thank you so much. I appreciate you massively. Today's case is one that you've asked for a lot. So, as ever, I'm getting round to covering all the cases that you guys have requested. And today's is a shocker. So let's get started. On the 13th of October 1997, this is around 4:30 a.m. in the morning, a frantic Julie Ray contacted the emergency services. She does that from a neighbour's house, and she claims at this point that she's basically discovered an intruder in her home in Lawrenceville, Illinois. She'd been woken by her son screaming. She was only wearing a t-shirt and underwear, and in spite of this, she runs into her son's room. And at that moment in time, she's confronted by a hideous sight, this man in a ski mask threatening. She struggled with him. She actually had a black belt in Taekwondo, so she ends up wrapped around his leg, and he just drags her across the floor. He strikes her head against the ground in the backyard and then manages to escape. Her son, 10-year-old Joel Kirkpatrick, he wasn't in his room. So immediately she's terrified. She thinks he's been abducted. But as soon as the police respond to the call, they're just instantly skeptical. As far as they can see, they can't see a sign of any struggle with the intruder that Julie's described. They can't see any evidence of forced entry. Nothing's been stolen. There's been no fingerprints. And furthermore, when they go and search for her son and they go into his bedroom, they make the most horrific discovery. Because on the far side of his bed, between the bed and the wall, they found Joel's body, and his pajamas were literally drenched in blood. He'd been murdered in his own bedroom, stabbed 12 times. In fact, his aorta had been severed twice. And they also found outside the bedroom was the murder weapon, and it was a steak knife from the kitchen. So this was a homicide that had occurred through the use of an item from the house itself. Now, Julie, the mother in this situation, she was a PhD student at Indiana University, really bright woman. But all of a sudden she finds herself as the prime suspect in her son's own murder. Julie, from the get-go, maintains her innocence, never ever changes that claim. She says, as far as she is concerned, she was confronted by this man. She tried her best to struggle with him. And clearly he, the intruder, must have killed her son. She had been injured during the struggle. So when you actually looked at the injuries she sustained, she had a black eye. She had rug burns on her knees. Think about that, rug burns on her knees. Why would you have them? You'd be dragged, wouldn't you, to get those? She had a wound on her right arm that needed stitches. She had lots of scratches and abrasions on her head. And it's not as if she hadn't been injured during the struggle. They could actually look at her and see that she was injured. She had a black eye. She had rug burns on her knees from being dragged. So just think about that. How would she give them herself? Clearly she's been dragged, because otherwise they wouldn't be there. She had a wound on her right arm, and that wound needed stitches. And she had lots of scratches and abrasions on her head, on both the shoulders and the tops of her feet. These are not injuries that you can inflict on yourself. But in spite of the fact that she's basically a walking assault victim, who even when you, as a layperson, look at the injuries and say, well, I can see those drag injuries, you know, the burns on her knees, her feet, etc. Clearly, this is somebody who's been involved in a struggle. The police seem to ignore that, and they ultimately charge her with first-degree murder. This is a woman with no previous history. This is a woman who's never been abusive. This is a woman with no reasoning as to want to murder her child. But they home in on her, and they cannot get rid of that bias that they believe if a child is found dead in their own home, the likelihood is the perpetrator is one of the primary caregivers, and they go for that. She ended up having to spend her life savings on hiring a defense counsel. And the case against her, wow, it was not strong. Let me just put it out there. As a case, it was not strong at all. It was flimsy and circumstantial. But when has that stopped prosecutors from just going ahead and trying to get somebody innocent sent to prison? I cover these cases more often than I should ever have to. When it came down to the evidence that they had against her, well, first of all, there's little physical evidence. They couldn't find forensic evidence that seemed to link her in the way that she was being accused. She had no obvious motive. And even though that was all there and the police were pressing ahead, what happened was the state's attorney declined to press charges. They said that there was insufficient evidence, which makes sense, because there was insufficient evidence. Of course so. That's never enough, is it? It's not enough to just go, oh, the reason that we're not going ahead with this is because there is complete insufficient evidence. It's obvious that she didn't do it. They were like, no. Let's get a special prosecutor and we'll appoint them. So when they did that, what they'd managed to find was that Joel's blood was found on Julie's t-shirt. Bear in mind that that t-shirt was also soaked in her blood from her injuries, but they found this tiny smear of Joel's blood identified. Julie at that point sensibly claims that it was likely transferred onto her during the struggle with the attacker. If anything, that should have strengthened her case, because if she had stabbed her son to death, she would have been covered in his blood. It's as simple as that. If she had been the perpetrator who had stabbed her son many times, she would literally have blood splatter stains, she would be drenched in it, and she wasn't. There was just a single smear. So aside from this little smear of blood, there is one other incriminating piece of evidence, and that is that Julie and her ex-husband, Len Kirkpatrick, are fighting. They're basically fighting in a custody battle over Joel. They've had this really acrimonious divorce. A lot of you will understand how dreadful the fallout and collateral damage of divorce can be, and they are struggling with the arrangements. They actually had shared custody, but Len had then remarried and been awarded residential custody, and Julie was contesting that. And I understand why. Shared custody is one thing when you get 50-50, but when you're going to take a child and place him in the custody with the father and the new wife, it's going to provoke some pretty difficult feelings. Julie then was left in a situation where she was only having a son at the weekends. So, of course, the prosecution are like, spurned ex-partner isn't happy with situation, thinks, I know how I'll punish my ex, I'll kill the child I love. But that's what they're going to go for. They claim that she killed her son to punish her ex-husband. Now, Len Kirkpatrick, her ex, actually stated that Julie had contemplated having an abortion when she was pregnant with Joel. Before we go on to talk about the fact that she vehemently denied that was ever the case, let me just put it out there. Lots of women get pregnant and are like, Jesus, what have I done? I don't think I can take responsibility for this life forever. I'm terrified. Maybe I'll have an abortion. And they go ahead and have the baby, and it's the best thing in the world. The fact that you may consider for a moment whilst pregnant terminating your pregnancy does not make you more likely to want to murder your child. That is absolute rubbish. That's probably not a professional context, the word rubbish, but you know where I'm going with it. It doesn't make sense. It's not linear. But she's now accused of course, not wanting this child. As I said, she vehemently denies this, and her evidence is actually supported by her own obstetrician, who says that at the end of Julie's pregnancy, there was a possibility that she may have lost the baby. And Julie confined herself to the bed in her final weeks to make sure that she did not lose that baby. Of course, the prosecution, they've got another story. They claim that the intruder, planning a murder, would have actually armed themselves prior to breaking in. So if you were going to go and kill somebody, you would make sure that you took a weapon with you. For those of you who watch a lot of serial killer, true crime, you'll know that an organised serial killer may well take a kill kit, but disorganised killers or opportunistic killers, they don't. They know that when they go into a house, they'll be able to find a hammer, they can use brute force, and they can find implements in a kitchen, which are all useful weapons. So that doesn't make sense either. Because, however, the knife from Julie's kitchen had been used, they say that this is a weight of evidence that this was somebody who would carry out the crime from the home itself. So prior to the actual trial starting, the prosecution announced that they intend to seek the death penalty. Now, on one level, that's terrible. Of course it is, because if you're an innocent person and you're potentially facing the death penalty, that is terrifying. But it also gives Julie a strange advantage in that moment, because there have been recent reforms which were aimed at making sure that innocent people were not convicted. And with this legislation, it meant that she could request 2 qualified attorneys to defend her. And she had that opportunity, which would have given her a really good fight, particularly with this pathetically flimsy evidence. However, a real tactical move occurs by the prosecution, because they know without a doubt that it's going to be hard beyond reasonable doubt to prove that this woman's had anything to do with her son's murder, and getting these people to come in as qualified attorneys, 2 of them to defend her, is going to likely show all the flaws in their case. They decide to withdraw the penalty. And that means that Julie is left with a single public defender to represent her. And I'm going to be honest, her defence was way in over his head, because the 3 prosecutors who were fighting for the prosecution, they were vastly more experienced. You won't be surprised, therefore, to discover that Julie was ultimately found guilty in March 2002. She was sentenced to 65 5 years. Now she, from the get-go, absolutely protested and said that she was an innocent woman. And if she was an innocent woman, that meant that a killer was still at large. And that's terrifying, isn't it? Let's just throw it out there that Julie is absolutely innocent based on what we know about the evidence, but they spent all of that time and resources and tactical expenditure to ensure that she went guilty, meaning that a ruthless, brutal child killer who was so bodacious in their confidence that they entered a home and killed a child in that home with a knife from the kitchen. To imagine that that kind of a human being is trawling our streets is truly horrifying. And to imagine the reason behind them being able to is because of the failures of the police in the investigation and the subsequent tactics of the prosecution, well, that's a whole heap of crazy. Let me take you back 5 years before this crime that we've just talked about. So on the 13th of May 1992, we have 19-year-old Fabienne Witherspoon. She's walking to her friend's apartment in Charleston, West Virginia. At this point, she spots a young man under a bridge and he's holding a sign, "I will work for food." And when she goes over, because she's a kind and compassionate person, he also shows her photos of his wife and children. Let's just imagine how we would all be in that situation. First of all, we see instant vulnerability. This individual is asking for work, seemingly desperate. And then when we make an effort to talk to them, they're telling us about how difficult their life is, and they're making us feel safe because they've got a wife and child. What have we got to fear about this kind of person? She feels really sorry for him. And Fabienne is like so many of us, we would feel sorry for him. Let's think about Ted Bundy and how he used vulnerability to get girls into his car by wearing a false pot on his arm or limping. It's effective. So Fabienne decides that she's going to go and get him food and clothes from a friend's apartment. She tells him to wait outside for her to go in and get these. But while she's collecting some of the items in the apartment, he suddenly comes up behind her and he takes a knife from the kitchen and he threatens her with it. And he tells her, "I'm not going to hurt you. You just got to do what I tell you to do." He takes her into the bathroom and he says to her that he's going to rape her. But Fabienne decides that absolutely brilliant decision. She decides to not comply. She picks up a ceramic duck from the toilet cistern and then she just repeatedly smashes it into this man's head. But he doesn't go down. Just think about the way that people are filled with adrenaline in these situations and it's coursing through his veins and he's fighting back as well. So they end up struggling. But Fabienne manages to get the knife out of his hand and then she just repeatedly stabs him again and again. But he's still struggling and he manages to get hold of a piano stool and he smashes it over her head. Now, at that point, she blacks out. And the next thing that she's aware of is that there are police and paramedics outside, and then she's taken to hospital. Clearly, she needs treatment. She's been violently assaulted, and she's got quite a serious head wound, and she's got the injury to her hand, the defensive wounds, and that actually requires surgery. But bear in mind, whilst Fabienne had definitely been injured, her attacker had come off a great deal worse. So he had also been forced to go to hospital for the treatment because she had badly injured him during the struggle. It's a shame at this point, let me tell you, that he didn't die. Genuinely. It would have been better for the world if Fabienne had managed to literally extinguish the very life that he was living. But they saw when they went and investigated the scene that there was blood all over it. And the reason for that is that she'd actually managed to perforate his kidney, his liver. She'd even sliced his testicle, which strangely makes me feel happy. Strange, but true. So he then gets arrested and ultimately, because there is so much forensic evidence there, he accepts a plea deal. He got sentenced to 5 years for malicious wounding, which I genuinely believe is next to nothing. I appreciate he said that he would go guilty for a plea deal, and that means that a victim of a horrible crime doesn't have to testify and there doesn't have to be a trial, which is expensive. But with respect, he intended to rape her, and who knows, he potentially was going to kill her. So malicious wounding, 5 years, for me feels incredibly minor. And we've seen this time and time again, where serious offenders accept plea deals, inevitably getting way less a sentence than they deserve, and then they go out and they strike again and again, and sometimes again. So logistically, this doesn't feel like a win for the system. Now, what Fabienne was completely unaware of at the time of that brutal attack was that she'd actually managed to join an elite group of people. She's one of the few humans who've ever survived an attack by a serial killer, because her attacker was a man named Tommy Lynn Sells. He had killed before, and he would kill again. Now, Fabienne had been lucky, but so many others wouldn't be. Now, like many serial killers, Sellers had had a really dysfunctional childhood. So let's take a look at what formed him. He was born in Oakland, California on the 28th of June, 1964. And he was one of 5 children to a single mother. And we can all appreciate that as a single parent, it's challenging because there's only one of you. And if you've got 5 children, it doesn't matter how brilliant you are as a parent. And there'll be so many women out there and so many men out there who have been single parents to large families. But we can all agree that attentionally, it's going to be more challenging to be able to give one-to-one time to a child because you don't have the amount of hours in the day that would lend itself to that. So there's going to be a diluting of the kind of attention that Sells gets as a child. Now, he and his sister, who were actually twins, they both contracted meningitis when they were 18 months of age, and his sister actually died, which is incredibly tragic. And at this point, Sells is actually sent to live with his aunt. I presume that was to do with the fact that his mother was struggling. It must be incredibly intolerable to lose a child, but also there was a level of dysfunction in the family, and that meant that he was better placed with his aunt, and his aunt embraced looking after him. And he's there until he's 5 years of age. But sadly at this point, and it is really sad because bear in mind, he'd gone from a relatively dysfunctional environment to a very functional environment. His aunt really loved him. She considered herself his mother. She wanted to have him permanently. She wanted to adopt him, to make him her actual legal child. And at this point, her sister is not happy. So the mother takes him back. And it's really sad because the truth is he could have had such a different life if he'd remained with his aunt, but instead he ends up getting sent back to his mother. And there is a lot of dysfunction by this point in the family. Things start to really spiral out of control. And when we think about children starting to drink, we all imagine that, of course, at times, children do use alcohol. It anesthetizes pain to some degree. Often it's readily available in people's homes. They see adults doing it. And you think, when kids get to 12, 13, 14, they're interested, intrigued, curious about alcohol. But he starts drinking aged 7. I didn't even know what alcohol was when I was 7. I don't think the vast majority of us did. So this child is clearly looking at this point for something that is going to temper whatever emotional distress he's experiencing. According to him, he actually said that he was also molested by a man named Willis Clark from the age of 8. And if it isn't terrible enough that we have a child now using alcohol to satiate pain, he's now using it as well to deal with this horrific abuse. And he's been removed from a loving home with an auntie who cared for him to a mother where he is not necessarily receiving the appropriate attention whatsoever. And to make even worse this scenario, Willis Clark was molesting him essentially with the full consent of his mother. So Sells has no protection in this situation. I'm not excusing his behaviour. What we know about a lot of serial killers is that trauma does play a role in their development, so to speak. Now, Sells said that one of the big motivators when he was committing his crimes was that he would relive the experiences that he had when he was being abused, when he was hurting other people. Don't get me wrong, that's a little bit of a convenient excuse as well, isn't it? I mean, we can always use our past experiences to excuse our present behaviour, and for him it might just be a way of telling a story that is more palatable to the listener. It could be that he's just indeed a murderous killer that was born essentially bad and was always going to turn out that way, and he uses that trauma to excuse what he's done. But it is notable that no child should have to go through these horrific experiences, and no matter how he turned out, he shouldn't have had to endure that pain as a kid. Also, the dependency escalates when he gets to 10 years of age. He starts taking drugs. The fact that he even has drugs around him and that he has access to them is deeply disturbing. And then we get to the age of 13, where his mother just abandons him. And I genuinely mean abandons him. She took his siblings and she just moved away. But there is a reasoning for that, because allegedly he tried to rape her, which is beyond disturbing. It does happen. We see situations and cases where children have sexually assaulted or raped parents. It is really hard to wrap your head around, but nonetheless, this is something that has been noted, and it is something that we see within the criminal juvenile system. But it's really hard to imagine that occurring. One can argue, well, it demonstrates the kind of twisted dysfunction in his sexual development because of what's been going on with him being abused and his mother consenting to that. It could be a way of exerting power and domination over a woman that he feels failed him. It can also show that he doesn't necessarily even relate to her as a parent because she didn't bring him up in his formative years. So there are lots of reasons why he may have acted that way, but we have to have some sympathy and empathy with the mother, even though she's a massive failure as far as protecting him, because to be attacked in a sexual way by a child is something that would be very traumatic. But she literally abandons him. So from the age of 14, he's homeless. And remember, he's got dependency issues now. So he's struggling with opioid addiction, amphetamines, and alcohol abuse issues. So lots of developmental foundational problems because the brain is developing and he is impacting on it day in, day out with this heavy drug and alcohol use. So he starts hitchhiking across the US, and this means that he also needs to get involved in crime because how is he going to eat otherwise? So the kind of crimes that he gets involved in are things like theft. He gets charged with driving under the influence. He gets charged with assault. So he's building and escalating in his criminal repertoire, shall we say. So by his teens, we've seen that he's heavily involved in crime. He's got dependency issues. He's sexually inappropriate. And also now he's homeless. So the recipe for disaster has certainly been dealt. And by the 1990s, he's only in his mid-20s, Sells has actually been diagnosed at this point with a personality disorder, antisocial, borderline and schizoid features, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, and psychosis. So he has big problems. And lots of people who watch my true crime and they themselves have certain personality disorders, it's difficult sometimes to manage, particularly when you don't have support. And this is an individual who is facing all of these problems, but also without any kind of support network around, which makes it even more difficult. And whilst borderline personality disorder is not going to lead to you committing crimes, when it comes down to antisocial, we have a different feature, because antisocial features lead often to people being very negative socially. And add to that the fact that there's some mania with his disorder and that he's got massive depression as well, and also breaks from reality with the psychosis. And this is somebody who is going to be struggling relatively often. Now, after his experience with Fabienne, that's a couple of years later, he still wants to get involved in harming people. He doesn't like what happened to him and how he was brought to justice. And he realises that whilst he still wants to carry on committing some really antisocial crimes, he needs to change the way he operates to evade capture. First of all, he realises he definitely doesn't want to get injured again. He nearly died when he attacked Fabienne. So he decides that the best way to deal with that is to select an easier target, to select smaller victims. So he decides that the best victims will be children. While Sells is in prison as well, he actually gets married. But the minute that he gets released, it just dissolves. It's really short time after he gets released that marriage ends. And instead he carries on with this really nomadic lifestyle, just traveling across the US. And of course, we all know that if you want to be a serial killer, then traveling from state to state is going to give you a lot more license and opportunity to do that without being captured. Because particularly back in the 90s and the 80s, it was far more difficult to work in a multidisciplinary, interagency way where people would note and connect crimes. So part of his mindset isn't just traveling because he's nomadic, it's traveling because he can carry out the crimes that he's going to get away with because he's moving from state to state. And just 4 months after he is released from prison in 1997, that's when 10-year-old Joel Kirkpatrick was murdered in his bedroom in Lawrenceville, Illinois. In the middle of the night, just sleeping, he was murdered. He was repeatedly stabbed with the knife from the kitchen, and it would later be accepted, of course, that the crime bore all the trademarks of Sells' MO. But as I explained earlier, Sells would never be a suspect in the investigation. He wasn't even on the authorities' radar at the time. They had absolutely no idea that he was a serial killer. Because instead, as I've told you, Joel's mother, Julie Ray, was falsely accused, tried, and convicted of her son's murder. So whilst Julie is totally unjustly incarcerated, the true killer is just able to carry on with his killing rampage. The evening of 30th December 1999, Sells meets with a man named Terry Harris. Now Harris, he owed him a cocaine drug debt of $5,000. So Harris had stated that he was going to travel to Kansas that night and he'd go get the money and pay Sells on his return. Sells accepts this, then goes to a bar, starts drinking, and he remains there until closing time, which was 2:15 a.m. in the morning. Then he goes to another bar, carries on drinking, and it's during this time when he's drinking and becoming inebriated that he starts mulling over in his mind about this $5,000. And he starts thinking to himself, you know what, I think that Harris is going to screw me over. And he creates this false belief system that leverages this idea that he can just go ahead and do something about it. And that's what he decides, I'm going to do something about this. So under the influence, after drinking for all that period of time, he drives to his house. He gets more beer, and then he grabs an 11-inch butcher's knife. Then he travels to Harris's home. It's a trailer in a remote location near Del Rio in Texas. And he had been there on previous occasions. In fact, he had met all of Harris's family, even the pet dog. And that's a real shame, because when he arrives, the dog does begin barking, but as dogs are, once they recognize that they know the person who's entering the property, it stops, and he kneels down and pets the dog, and then Sells enters the property through an open window. In the room was Harris's 14-year-old son, Justin. Now, Justin was blind. The boy didn't know who'd entered the room, but obviously heard that somebody had, and he muttered about wishing that people would stop going in his room, which is a completely normal adolescent response, isn't it? It's like, this is my territory. Remove yourself from my territory. Not being funny, but you don't pay any of the bills with respect, and you don't buy any of the food, so I can come in this room. Is it just me? Is it just me who feels that way about the kids? They're like, don't touch my phone, I pay for your phone. That's my phone, to be fair. If I want to look at your phone, I'll use your phone and I'll take your phone. I'll throw it in the river. I can do all those things. I'm the one paying for it. Sorry, I was a bit triggered then. Apologies. Anyway, he mutters about somebody being in his room. So then Sells leaves that room and enters another room. And here there's a young girl who's sleeping alone. Then he enters a room where Harris's wife, Crystal's sleeping in bed with her daughter. He actually touched Crystal's leg while she was sleeping. At that point, he thought to himself, maybe I'll rape her. But for whatever reason, he decides to check out who's in another room. It's here that he sees a girl sleeping on the bottom bunk of a bunk bed. This was Harris's 13-year-old daughter, Kayleen. Now, Kayleen was actually having a sleepover with her friends, 10-year-old Crystal Sells and her little sister, 7-year-old Mark. Now, Mark was the girl Sells had seen sleeping alone, and she'd actually quarrelled with her sister, Crystal, earlier, and been told by Crystal, you need to go and sleep in a different room. Now, in hindsight, that most probably saved that little girl's life. So at this point, Sells was unaware that Crystal was sleeping on the top bunk because he was completely focused on Kayleen. He hadn't noticed that there was another girl in the room. So he's fixated on this little girl. So then Sells lies alongside Kayleen, and like the horrible sexual predator he is, he starts to molest her. He cuts off her underwear, he cuts off her bra with a knife, he starts groping her, he inserts his finger inside her, and it's at this point Kayleen wakes up and she just jumps out of bed. She's petrified, and she shouts straight away for Crystal and tells Crystal to get her mother. Of course she does, it's what children do, isn't it? When you're absolutely terrified, the only person that you want is your mum or your dad. So that's what she's screaming to Crystal to go and get. Sells stands in front of the door, which means that Kayleen can't leave. However, she walks towards him in the dark because I imagine at this point she just wants to get away, and she's hoping that maybe he'll move. And as she does, Sells just stabs her in the arm with the knife. Then he turns on the bedroom light. Now, Crystal awoke, by the way, to see Sells covering Kayleen's mouth and holding a knife in his right hand. Now, to her horror, she actually watches as he launches a frenzied knife attack on her friend. He's just repeatedly stabbing Kayleen in the chest and the abdomen, and then slashes her throat. This is all in front of Crystal. Kayleen falls to the floor, gasping for air. She's gurgling, and Sells then slashes her throat 2 further times. He's about to leave the room, and then he suddenly stops, and he turns his attention to Crystal on the top bunk. He hadn't noticed her, of course. Yes, Kayleen screamed for her to go and get her mother, but at the end of the day, he hadn't connected, and now he's looking at her. And Crystal's clever. She knows that this man is a crazed murderer, and she knows that her life is in massive danger. And Crystal says, I'll be quiet, I won't tell anyone. She even covers her throat with her hands, understandably. She's 10 years of age. She knows that this man has just brutalised this child in front of her. She knows that he is capable of killing her too, and she wants to protect that area. Sells tells her to move her hands from her throat. Can you imagine doing that to a little girl? She's just witnessed her friend being brutally attacked, the throat cut. She's witnessing the blood. She's covering her throat, and then he tells her to move her hands. He then slashes her throat twice. At this point, he leaves the room. He flees through the front door, but not before he wipes the door handle free of fingerprints. He disposes of a knife in a nearby field, and the blade had actually been bent with the ferocity of the attack on children. Now, bear in mind, we have Crystal. She's had her throat cut, but at that point, she had instinctively known that she needed to play dead. So she lies there for a few minutes even after he's left, because she wants to make sure that he doesn't come back, and she hears his car drive away. And at this point, she goes over to her critically injured friend. Now, due to the injuries to her throat, she couldn't even speak to comfort her. But instead, she lies next to her. She rubs her back. Kayleen was still alive at this point. She was making gasping sounds. But even though her friend was with her, comforting her, in the end, she falls silent and she died. But Crystal was there with her. It's incredible to imagine that poor little girl, 10-year-old child, comforting her mortally wounded friend, knowing that her time was coming and just being present with her so that she didn't die alone. Crystal then goes into the room where her younger sister was sleeping alone, and she just tries to wake her, but she can't rouse her. And she fears, of course, that the entire Harris family and her sister had been attacked because she can't get her to wake up and she doesn't want to look in the other room. She's traumatized. So Crystal climbs through a window and she staggers. That little girl, that 10-year-old hero, staggers a quarter of a mile to a neighbour's. That neighbour opens the door and they find this little girl holding her throat, covered in blood, unable to speak. And Crystal indicates that she wants to write something down, and she scribbles down these few words and she says, "My neck needs help. Harrises are hurt. Tell them to hurry. Will I live?" Can you imagine that she's writing, "Will I live?" That's how terrified she is. Even when she's trying to protect others, even when she's bleeding out from her throat, she's asking that question. She's looking for reassurance that I will be okay. Tell me I will be okay. It was later established that she'd suffered a 5-inch wound across her neck, and it had nearly suffered her carotid artery. Now, if that had been cut, she would have been dead in minutes. Also, the reason that she couldn't speak was part of her vocal cords had actually been severed. She had lots of defensive wounds to both of her hands, and the medical experts who examined this child, they said that it was a miracle that she had survived. When they carried out the autopsy on Kayleen, it was established that her injuries were horrific. She had a 5-inch wound across her neck. That 5-inch wound was caused by 3 separate cuts. He'd severed her right carotid artery and her right jugular vein. He'd also severed her voice box. She was stabbed a total of 16 times. 3 of those times went completely through her body. 4 stab wounds went through her chest. 3 penetrated her left lung and 1 her right lung. All of those alone, by the way, would have been fatal. The stab wound to her body actually penetrated 6 inches into Kayleen's abdominal cavity. It severed her liver and duodenum, which is another fatal injury. And multiple stab wounds to her left hip she endured as well. There was a stab wound to her lower back. It severed a renal artery. Again, that would have been fatal. She had multiple stab wounds to the right arm. One was 4 inches deep. Another had gone literally completely through her arm. And also there was bruising on her body that indicated a sexual assault. Now, Crystal, she was actually able to supply police with a description of her attacker from the hospital bed. And she was able to help compile an artist's impression of the man. And this meant that Sells was soon identified. And he gets arrested on the 2nd of January 2000. Now, in light of eyewitnesses' accounts and, of course, significant forensic evidence, he soon went ahead and confessed to the crime. Not because he wanted to take responsibility for it, but because there was no other option. It was absolutely bound to rights every day of the week. There is not a chance that they would not have been able to have him for this crime. And whilst he's confessing, he actually takes the officers through a tour of Harris's home, describing what he'd done. So it's obvious that he's going to be found guilty. It's as simple as that. And a Val Verde County jury sent 49-year-old Sells to death row in November 2009. And I think if anybody deserves it, well, he certainly does. But this is only the beginning. Because it's only after this, it's only after him being sentenced to death row for this crime that the true extent of his crimes would actually be revealed. Because during his incarceration, well, Sells begins to confess to more and more murders. Now, whether or not he was responsible for every single one of them, we are never going to know. Truth is that some people believe that he tried to play the system, he wanted to avoid the death penalty, and he felt that he could maybe cut deals by admitting to crimes that he hadn't actually committed. So I have to put that out there. And the crimes themselves and his confessions, well, they ultimately earned him the monikers cross-country killer and coast-to-coast killer. And that was on account of his alleged nomadic crime sprees. Now, he claimed to have killed dozens of men, women and children during a 20-year killing spree. He claimed that he killed for the first time when he was 15 years of age. He said that he broke into 39-year-old John Cade's house. He said that the reason he did that was that he'd seen him performing an oral sex on a boy and it incensed him and made him rageful, and the consequence was that he shot him in a fit of rage. So he's using his own molestation as a trigger and a reasoning behind that action. Sells also goes on to claim responsibility for several other murders, and these included, in July 1985, a 21-year-old Sells at this point is working at a carnival in Missouri. And at this point he meets 28-year-old Ina Cord and her 4-year-old son, Rory. Now, according to Sells, Ina invites him to her home and they have sex with each other, but later he awakes and he finds her stealing from his backpack. So he feels that it is an appropriate reaction to beat her to death with a baseball bat than to beat her son to death because he didn't want to leave a witness. Her son was 4 years old. 4. But his argument is, well, she was going to steal from me, so I just beat her to death horrifically, and then I beat her son to death. That is not an appropriate consequence. So it doesn't matter whether she was taking anything from his backpack. At the end of the day, it's highly doubtful that she was. It just was that he wanted an excuse to kill, and he used that as an excuse. But as far as I'm concerned, it's such an overreaction to this. I doubt very much at all that what he said played out. I just think he was looking for somebody to murder and creating an excuse to the police as to why he went ahead and did it. In 1987, well, he claims to have murdered missing Stephanie Stroh. Now, Stephanie, she was actually a student who was on a 2-year round-the-world trip. But she ends up vanishing in Winnemucca, Nevada. And this is when she's actually on her way home, which is just heartbreaking. The idea that she was literally on her way home and she never got there because of this man is just so upsetting for the family. Now, Sells at this point is working for a roofing company in Winnemucca at the time. Now, this is near where she was last seen. And he said he managed to pick her up when she was hitchhiking, at which point he drugged her with LSD, strangled her, encased her feet in concrete, and dumped her in a hot spring. Now, her body has never been found with respect, but this is one that he took responsibility for. In May 1987, this is according to Sells again, he killed 27-year-old hairdresser Suzanne Cox. Now, her skeletal remains were found 8 years later. So again, it's one he's taking responsibility for, and at least they got the remains where this one is concerned. In November 1987, this is at a point where Sells claims that he's killed 4 members of the Dardeen family. But I will tell you from my research, he did give differing versions of events. So in one of the versions of events, Sells says that he'd spotted a trailer home that was for sale near Ina, Illinois. And he goes ahead, knocks on the door. It's answered by 29-year-old Keith Dardeen. Now, Keith was actually known locally to be a very wary man. And the reason that he was wary was there'd been several murders that had taken place in the locality during recent years. So Sells tells the story that he overpowered Keith and then he makes him bind and gag his wife and his son at gunpoint. And then he makes Keith drive him to a nearby field, at which point he cuts off his penis before shooting him multiple times in the head. And then apparently he returns to the property and he beats Keith's 3-year-old boy, Peter, to death with a baseball bat. So what's even sadder is that Keith was actually meant to have brought Peter that baseball bat as a birthday present. And then, allegedly, he attacked Keith's wife, who was 30-year-old Elaine, and she was 7 months pregnant at the time, and the beating was so horrific that she went into labour and she actually gave birth to a daughter. They'd already chosen a name for that little girl, Casey. Sells then went on to bludgeon the newborn to death with a baseball bat, and either before or after raping and beating Elaine to death, Sells mutilated her breasts. According to some other reports as well, he then violated her with the baseball bat post-mortem, and it was actually left inside her vagina. Now, police actually found Elaine, Peter and Casey's bodies, and they were all at the time tucked up in the same bed. And that means that the killer had certainly taken time at the property. They'd also attempted to clean up the crime scene. Now, authorities did initially suspect that Keith was the person, so the husband of the family and the father of the family, was responsible for familicide, essentially, of family annihilation. But of course, they then found his mutilated body in a field. So it was discovered by hunters, his body in fact, and they suddenly realised that it wasn't the father and husband in this case at all. So that is just one of the most horrific scenes that I've ever described in one of these true crime videos, isn't it? Just what happened to that family, that pure newborn baby, all of those things that just feel so outside the realms of human behaviour. When we talk about human predators, I mean, I think that scene describes it so appropriately and accurately. He also claims that in April 1999, this is in broad daylight by the way, he apparently abducts 9-year-old Mary Beatriz Perez. This is during fiesta celebrations in San Antonio, Texas. She was there with the family, but he apparently snatched her from them in a second. He then strangled her to death and he dumped her body along the Alazan Creek. Now, her body was found 10 days later, and when they found her, she was only wearing a Mickey Mouse t-shirt and a single white sock. So Sells was ultimately convicted of Mary's murder and given a life sentence for it. In May 1999, Sells said that he spotted a 13-year-old Haley McHone playing on the swings in Lexington, Kentucky. He said that in this case, he managed to lure her into the woods, and then he stripped her, he raped her, and he strangled her. And he said after he'd done that, he rode away on her bike, a bike that he later sold for $20. He used that $20 to go out and buy alcohol. He was actually arrested later that very same day for being drunk and disorderly. He spent a night in the cells drunk, or the drunk tank as it's known at the police station, but got up the next morning, was set free, and he left before the body was even found. So he'd actually cut loose from that whole area. But isn't it crazy to imagine that he was in police custody, sobering up after just murdering that poor child? In 2003, Sells was actually interviewed by police whilst on Texas death row because he was given an opportunity to confess yet again to another murder. So at this point, he claims that he killed a young boy. This is in October 1997. He said he broke into a house in Lawrenceville, Illinois, that he had taken a knife from a butcher's block in the kitchen. He described how after the killing, a woman had tried to fight him off. She'd wrapped herself around his leg. He dragged her across the carpet. Police were later able to confirm that he had been in Lawrenceville at the time of that murder. Authorities finally acknowledged that Julie Ray may not have murdered her 10-year-old son, Joel Kirkpatrick, in 1997. But by this stage, she had been in prison serving a murder sentence for more than 2 years. She had been waking up and going to sleep day in, day out, knowing that her child had been brutally slain, that she had heroically fought off that attacker, only to discover that it was already too late for her son. And yet the police had spent the entire investigation flimsily pinning a crime on her, and the prosecution had used tactics and strategy to ensure that she went down for a crime that she never committed, thus allowing a serial killer to continue their spree of murder. The appeal court, they ultimately ruled to vacate her conviction. But let me tell you, the prosecution, they weren't having it. They were unable to accept that there had been a miscarriage of justice. Oh my God, the egos of some lawyers. The egos are so huge that I am surprised they can fit into the judge's quarters. I am surprised a courtroom does not need to be extended just to carry in the weight of said egos. They're not having it. So when Julie's released, she's rearrested immediately. Now, during the retrial, the defense team, they play an audio recording of Sells' detailed confession. The prosecution are like, okay, so you've got like a taped confession of like a known killer who has like a really seriously similar MO to the crime that's been carried out here. But at the end of the day, he's just making it up. I mean, it's probably way more likely that the flimsy evidence that we pinned on this poor mother, who clearly had carpet burns all over her and a stab wound and had been dragged along and had been violently assaulted whilst fighting this attacker off. It's clear that she did that to herself. And at the end of the day, even though there was no history of abuse and she was a really good parent and she was doing well in her PhD, it's more likely that she's the murderer than the actual murderer who's been convicted of murder and is on death row. Literally. That's what they did. They say that the confession is fake. By the way, this is despite there being 52 points of corroboration between Sells' confession and Joel's murder. Literally an A to Z of how it happened that perfectly corroborates scene, injuries, reality, murder, weapon, environment, set out of home, so on and so forth. The prosecution have egos so big they didn't care about the real murderer being brought to justice. They just wanted to be proven right. Now, fortunately, the jury, which is made up of people like you and me, we actually have good consciousness and good conscience, and we aren't stupid. So they find her, thank God, not guilty. But it's difficult because in spite of Sells' confession, he would actually never be charged with Joel's murder because as he was on death row, Texas authorities said that they didn't want to move him to Illinois to help with the investigation. And that means that Julie hasn't just lost her freedom, hasn't just had people cast aspersions on her, including her ex, who, as far as I'm concerned, used the scenario of their custody problems against her in a way that had a magnitude that led to her being imprisoned. I mean, that's mind-blowing in itself, isn't it? She went through hell. While she was incarcerated, she'd also suffered horribly at the hands of prison guards and other inmates because they all considered that she was a child killer. Think about that. Everybody hated her. She did nothing wrong. But everybody judged her so harshly. So not only had her son been brutally killed, she'd then been wrongly convicted of his murder, and largely on the strength of completely incorrect evidence from blood spatter analysts. When you look at Julie's case, it actually bears striking similarities to that of the Indiana State Trooper David Cam. It's a case I've covered. Like he was also fitted up horrendously by the police. So he basically, just to give you a quick précis of it, discovered his wife and 2 children who'd been shot to death in their home in 2000. And they managed to find 8 specks of blood that were found in his clothes. And this got him convicted of their murders based largely on this blood spatter evidence. He spent 13 years in prison before the true killer was identified. So arguably the same kind of misinformation, misuse of blood spatter was used in this case. And it is appalling because we're talking about innocent people being sent to prison, dealing with the grief of their loved ones being killed, not getting the justice that they deserve, and being horribly treated because everybody thinks that they're a terrible human. Now, the truth is, we're never going to know absolutely just how many men, women, and children Sells killed. Now, he states it's between 75 and 100 people. He said that he got his high from committing the killings, and although he killed in many different ways, as we've evidenced in some of the ones I've outlined, he actually claimed that the one that he enjoyed most was strangulation. And he said the reason that he enjoyed strangulation was that he liked looking straight into their eyes. He liked watching as the light faded away. Think about Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker killer. One of the things that he did in a crime was remove the eyes of his victims because he liked to elicit the way that they looked in fear at him when he killed them. It's a very similar power domination experience, and similarly that's what Sells is saying, it's that playing God. And he said, in fact, that he felt when he was choking them to death and looking into their eyes, he could see that their souls were being set free. Just going to put it out there, Sells. That's not souls being set free, although arguably I'm a big believer in the great next dimension and think it's going to be wonderful, and I imagine that every single one of his victims is going to a wholly different place than he'll ever be going. But nonetheless, it's not that the soul's being set free, it's that you've choked them to death and they're dead. Just going to put that out there. But again, isn't it interesting how serial killers often use these kind of language bases, the semantics that they operate within, which is all about making it less that they've murdered them and more that they've either possessed them or let them be free, and so on and so forth. He also went ahead and said that another reason that he murdered people is because it was a coping strategy. He said it was a way of him dealing with that childhood abuse that he suffered. He said that when he murdered people, it helped to take away that rage, and it actually calmed him down for a while. Again, that's nonsensical because it doesn't take away the rage, it transfers it with murderous intent and effect. But I understand that what he's saying is he has this unbearable feeling that he then is able to bear through murder. Now, in many of the confessions to the crimes that he claimed to have committed, he went ahead and tried to blame the victims. He said that it was the victims who had provoked him in some way, and that was important to him. It's as if, even though his actions were completely reprehensible and nobody could ever provoke anybody to do what he did to them, it was a way of being one step away from the true heinous actions that he elicited on his victims. So this justification he uses, it doesn't make sense to rational human beings like us, but to him, it does. So on the first murder, he claims that he witnessed that man sexually abusing a boy. And in one version of the events that he gives about the Dardeen murders, he claims that Keith Dardeen had sexually propositioned him. So again, he puts Keith Dardeen as the provocateur, and he's then eliciting this response because obviously the rage that is within Sells is huge. So he's given license to attack the family because he feels that Keith Dardeen has provoked him in some way. Now, we're never going to know how many people Sells did kill, but there is one thing that we can absolutely deduct from the crimes that we know he committed. He was a cold-blooded killer who displayed zero empathy or remorse for his victims. And he was once quoted as saying this, "Let me share this with you." He said, "I am hatred. When you look at me, you look at hate. I don't know what love is. 2 words I don't like to use are love and sorry, because I'm about hate." Wow. I mean, the one thing I will say about him is that he has a level of self-awareness there, doesn't he? Because certainly his actions are lethal and hateful. And arguably, at least he isn't trying to pretend that deep within him, he's just a misunderstood guy. And it's amazing how many serial killers come along and try to use that method. "Oh, you know what? I'm just a really nice guy who went a bit wrong. But now, I don't know, I found Jesus and everything's fine." Not in Sells' case. He just acknowledges that he is born bad, made bad. Whichever way, he is just pure evil. Sells was executed by lethal injection on the 3rd of April 2014. And when he was put to death, he actually declined to give a final statement. He even declined to make any eye contact with his victims' families. After the lethal injection was administered, he closed his eyes and began snoring. He was pronounced dead 13 minutes later. Tell you what's really strange about that? That was a far more peaceful death than any of his many victims. Sells will undoubtedly go down as one of the most terrifying human beings that could have walked this planet. And what a shame that Julie had to put up with that period of time in prison a period of time that she should have been allowed to nurse her wounds and deal with her grief. It's unforgivable, and I hope that her life has moved on in a way that is successful and progressive, although she will never be able to make up for the loss of that gorgeous son of hers. I hope you found this case interesting. It was really interesting to research, and again, it just reminds me to give you that message. In this case, the reminder that if you are ever put in a position like Fabienne was, remember, do not comply. Under any circumstances, do not comply. Join me again next time for another True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. Thank you so much for joining me. Give me a like, give me a comment, let me know your thoughts. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed, and remember, I am crime and consistency, so I'll see you on Wednesday or Friday every single week. Take care, be safe.